It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing as it relates to students in general. Of course, my work has an emphasis on men of color, but what I think you'll find is that a lot of the recommendations that I have are things that are cross-cutting, things that tend to work for all of our student demographics who experience what we call disproportionate impact. Before I begin, though, I'd just like to thank a few people for really this opportunity to be here and have the chance to speak with you. First is the Achieving the Dream Subcommittee. I think we should give them a round of applause for helping to put this together today. And in particular, Karen Stills, who I've had the opportunity to engage with for several years now, just a wonderful leader, thought leader, that is, I should say, practitioner, just doing great work in the field, is highly respected, and then also Carla for helping me get set up here. And of course, I also want to thank Dr. Morris and Dr. Adamus for the introduction and bringing us here and helping to support this convening. So today we have a few things that we're going to accomplish, which is going to be fun. So we have an ambitious schedule. So the first part of this presentation is really going to focus on talking about issues of equity. What are some general things that we've learned from our research as it relates to serving students in general, in terms of what does it take for us to be as successful as we could possibly be in the classroom. We're going to then take a break. And especially since we have a lot of people who've been drinking coffee this morning, in about an hour, we'll probably need that. Then we'll come back, and then we're going to kind of transition to a focus on unconscious bias and microaggressions and talking about what does that look like, what are some things that we could do just to create greater awareness of what those topics look like. And then after that, there's going to be breakout sessions. So there's going to be several breakout sessions that will talk about different topics. I'll be doing 2 sessions. Both of them are Q&As, but I'm going to start out with a little bit of material that I think will be helpful to kind of center the conversation. So the first one will focus really on our work in doing equity. What are some things that tend to hold campuses back from being successful in doing some equity work? So I'll kind of lead with that, and then we'll go into what does that look like. And then the second session will again be a Q&A, but we'll talk about we have a taxonomy that I'll show you shortly, and I'll talk about what are some strategies and practices that we can help use to move forward the needle here at El Centro. So each one of those will be Q&As, but they'll be themed in terms of what we'll be talking about there. So with that being said, I think we should go ahead and plunge in. And just again to note that this first presentation, we'll be talking about national trends and issues that face our students and student success in general. And then I'll be talking about some practices that tend to work in helping to address areas of disproportionate impact. So a little bit about me and the center that I have the opportunity to co-direct at San Diego State. It's called the Community College Equity Assessment Lab. And the lab is a research and practice center that I co-direct with Dr. Frank Harris III, who we do a lot of work together as it focuses on our underserved students. And in the center, we began in 2011, really focused solely on men of color, and that's still a very predominant theme in the work that we do. We began as a minority male community college collaborative in 2011. And then a couple years ago, we rebranded as we began to do more work on students of color in general. We've done a lot of work on students who experience food and housing insecurity. So as we began to do more work on different subpopulations, we thought it was important to have our name and title be reflective of that. But central to the work that we do still is a focus on equity. And we'll talk about what that means and what that looks like here momentarily. As part of the work that we do, we collect data from colleges. So a lot of what we do is data collection at community colleges around the country. And we use a certain set of tools that help us to understand what are some factors that influence equity for different student demographics. And one of the instruments that we use is called the Community College Success Measure. And what it is a institutional level needs assessment tool. It's an instrument that's distributed in randomly selected course sections. And we use that to basically help identify what are some areas that the campus needs to focus on for improving outcomes for our underserved students in general, and being able to look at that across different types of underserved student populations. We also have an instructional development inventory and staff development inventory, which look at 14 different key practices that we know are important for our underserved students, so we can have an idea of what does that look like. So for example, we might look at culturally relevant teaching, or validating practices, or expression of authentic care, or understanding of microaggressions, some core things that we know are important when we're talking about our underserved students, and then break that apart saying, okay, so what does that look like for our full-timers and our part-timers and those who are primarily teaching developmental education or basic skills versus those who are teaching major required courses. And so we look at different populations. What does it look like for our faculty members who are teaching primarily in STEM versus those who are in the arts or in the humanities or the social sciences? So I say all that because a lot of the information from these surveys is what informs the presentation that you're about to see, as well as data from the focus groups that we've done with students and interviews that we've done with faculty members. So a lot of different data sources are going to be in here, but it's all a result of this work that we've been doing at community colleges that we've had the privilege to do really now, again, over the past few years. But as we start, it's important for us to remember why we're here. The focus of today is on equity. And there's a lot of different connotations as to what that means. And I'm sure many of you have seen like the depiction of a baseball field. How many people have seen that where it's a baseball field and there's different sized boxes so people can be able to peer over the fence? Anybody seen that before? Okay, hands are going up. Okay. So there's different ways for us to conceptualize equity. In terms of the work that we do, this is the definition that we use. Equity refers to a heightened focus on groups who are experiencing disproportionate impact. So disproportionate impact are when we look at our student outcomes, and I'll show you what that looks like here momentarily, where we look at some student outcomes and we see that some groups are performing above those and others are performing below where we'd like them to be. And the idea is that there shouldn't really be gaps. We want to be able to fill those gaps, right, while also continuing to move forward the general student demographic in terms of overall outcomes for retention and success. So we want to focus on groups experiencing disproportionate impact in order to remediate disparities in their experiences and outcomes. Notice that we're not focusing on remediating them, but remediating their experiences and their outcomes, recognizing that there is a need to focus on what we are doing. And that's why I really like this exercise that's going to be done throughout today, and I hope that everyone will participate in that, because really, in order for us to really focus on equity, we have to have that internal focus and really think about what is it that we're doing. Because one of the things that we find is that when we go to different places and talk to different campus communities, that you'll go to a campus and you'll see that there's some pretty large gaps in terms of student success. And you'll say, okay, so what is going on? And sometimes educators will exclaim, well, what are these students not doing, right? Why is it, that they're not being successful? What is it going to take for them to be able to focus more? And that's certainly, a conversation that is worthy of having. The challenge is it's a conversation that we probably have too often without really having the other side of that conversation, which is what are we doing or not doing that's within our own control. And the truth is, we have more control over the success of students than oftentimes we give credit for. So, for example, in our research, we do different types of models to model what does it take for a student to be successful. So we look at background characteristics of the student. What is their age? What is their race and ethnicity and gender? Are they a veteran? Are they a student who experiences food and housing insecurity? We look at environmental pressures in terms of how much they're working. Are they, do they have a stable job? Are they transitioning to campus? Are they having problems with transportation? So we look at all these different factors, and then we also look at factors related to the campus environment in terms of, do students feel a sense of belonging? Are they receiving validation? And what we find is this, that we can take all of that information about their background and all that information about the environmental pressures that they face And it still does not even equate to the amount of variance that we can explain in our models that's comprised with the campus climate and ethos in terms of validation, belonging, and feeling a welcomeness to engage. In fact, the campus environment, the things that we bring to the table, account for 3 to 4 times the variance that we see in those things that are specific to the students. So for me, as an educator, I feel like that's empowering, right? Because it means that I have much more control than, again, sometimes I might realize that I do. So when we're talking about our students who are experiencing disproportionate impact, you'll see on the side of the screen that there's some different student groups that we have to be attentive to. So we have to be attentive to our students of color. Our Black, Latino, Native American, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, and other students who fall into those demographics. Our students who are current and former foster youth, our students with disabilities, our low-income students, our veterans, our students who experience food insecurity, our students who experience housing insecurities. So there's a wide array of students that we have to be focused on. And of course, today I'm primarily talking about our students of color because that is a central group who experiences disproportionate impact. But it's also important for us to recognize that there is a wider group of students who fall into this designation of really needing an additional focus. And what's more true here is that when we're looking at our students of color, they tend to be overrepresented in all of those other categories in terms of former foster youth, students with disabilities, low-income students, students who experience different types of insecurities. So here's some data that's at your table. Everyone at your table, you have a sheet that has some outcomes data. Can everyone just hold it up so we're all making sure we're looking at the same thing? All right. So on that sheet, you have data for retention and data for student success. And here are some of the success rates that are from this institution. This is just a screenshot of that data. And you can see that when we look at overall course success, those are students who are achieving a passing grade, A, B, C, in a class in comparison to those who are enrolled in a course. We can see that there are some differences in outcomes, both between genders in terms of those who identify as male or those who identify as female, as well as by racial categories within that. For example, if we look at females, we can see that 65% success rate for Black females in comparison to, say, a 79% success rate for white females, but the overall success rate is 75%. So we can see that some groups are falling above that, some groups are falling below that. Again, these are helping us to identify where there are groups who are experiencing disproportionate impact on our campus. And there's different ways in which we could look at it. We could look at our white students and compare our students of color to our white students. We could look at the overall and compare students who fall above and students who fall below. But ultimately, the goal is to reduce those barriers as much as possible. And there's different ways to rationalize this, as I mentioned before. And one of the quotes that I like to use in the work that I do is from W. Edward Deming and Paul Batalden, which says that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. And when we see these outcomes, there's a lot of ways we can rationalize it, but one part is that is what our system was designed to produce. So if we want to change these outcomes, then we have to change the system. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've been to a place and I've said that, and then someone will say, well, you're right. So can you tell those folks in the district office that they need to do this? Or can you tell the president that we would like for the president to do this or that? And that's certainly, those are certainly aspects of our system, but the most powerful components of our system when we're talking about instruction and talking about student learning and development are us as educators, as faculty. The ones who are in the classroom, who are engaging the students on an everyday basis. So I like for us to bring it down to a more personal level. Every system, every college, every department, every division, every classroom is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. And it's only when we start to bring it down to that personal level that we start to really see the role that we have in changing the outcomes that are evident. So many of you may be familiar with, and if not, I would definitely recommend looking at anything that she's written, the work of Dr. Stella Ben-Simon. And her work has been central to really this national understanding of what is equity. and how do we go about addressing equity issues. And she talks about these concepts of being equity-minded educators. And she says that there are essentially 4 different characteristics of an educator who is committed to equity. The first is they are cognizant of exclusionary practices and systemic inequities that produce outcome disparities. So they're cognizant of the role that the system has. Again, every system is perfectly designed. They attribute those breakdowns not to student deficits solely, but to institutional performance as well. They continuously reflect upon their roles. So we want to get to this point where we're looking at what we see in terms of outcome disparities, and we're saying, okay, what am I doing as part of this? What am I not doing? What am I contributing to these outcome disparities, right? Continuously being reflective, recognizing that this is a great institution that does great work, but every institution can do better, every educator can do better, all of us can. And that's what we're in this field for. And the other part of it is being willing to have those difficult conversations and challenge our colleagues. If we see colleagues doing things that we know aren't really designed to produce equity, to really just be honest and say, you know what, we need to be thinking about this a little bit differently. It's just important for us to do. The other thing I wanted to talk about, which I think is really important, and this kind of lays a foundation, and if you find yourself saying, oh wow, I want to hear more about this, the second breakout session I'll do is going to talk more about this taxonomy. But it's a taxonomy on perspectives of educators. And so outside of my role at SDSU, I operate a center called the Center for Organizational Responsibility and Advancement. And what we do is we have online programs, professional development programs, and teaching boys and men of color, teaching men of color, supporting men of color outside of classroom, unconscious bias, microaggressions, intercultural communication, a whole bunch of different areas, right? And we have partnerships with about 60 colleges across the country where basically they make our programs available to their faculty. And as part of partnering with those institutions, we learned some really interesting things about rolling out institutional-wide professional development that's intensive and ongoing. First is, it's difficult to do, because you have certain people who are going to be ready and willing and able and wanting to participate. And then you also have some folks who might have some different perspectives about it. And so what we advocate is not necessarily having a one-size-fits-all approach. So I'm going to talk about some different perspectives, and I want you to think about, where do you fall within this taxonomy? And if you find yourself falling into a place where you don't really want to be, thinking about how can you move forward to the next level. So one of the things that will happen is that a college will invite myself or Frank to come out and do a training on microaggressions, right? Microaggressions, for those of you who may not be aware, are kind of the more subtle forms of racism that are typically unconscious, typically things that we say and we do that we don't even realize that we're doing, that end up having the same effect. They can be negative, right? But they don't necessarily come from a place where we're trying to hurt one another. They're just part of the ways that we operate that we're not even aware of, right? And so what we try to do is help bring the unconscious, right, to conscious, right, so that we're aware of some of those things. And so a college will invite us out and they'll say, okay, we're gonna have a brown bag that's focused on microaggressions. And when we show up, it's an optional event anyone can attend. What we'll find is that oftentimes the person who's putting on that event will be a little bit kind of dismayed. They'll be like, well, when we decided to plan this event, we really had Jerry in mind, right? But Jerry didn't show up, right? In fact, the people who showed up look like the people who helped plan this event, and not only that, these are the people who always show up. And so we would start to see that it would end up being like these same, like these usual suspects of these great people who were doing great work, but it was the people who it was designed to reach never really came. And so we decided to recognize that there are really 2 different characteristics that distinguish people's commitment to this work. So one is knowing what to do, right? Knowing the strategies and practices that are necessary for advancing success for our underserved students or our men of color. And the second is having a willingness to do it. And so you can be either willing or unwilling, or know what to do or not know what to do. And the combination of those 4 characteristics produce this kind of frame that you see here. And in that top right-hand corner, you'll see a group that says KW. Those are people who know what to do and they have a willingness to do it. So for those of you who haven't seen this before, what do you think we might call those people who know what to do and have a willingness to do it? Say what? The choir? Anything else? Cheerleaders? We hear champions. We hear advocates. We hear a lot of great things. Sometimes people will jokingly say unicorns because they're hard to find. But yes, Karen, of course, you get the award today. It's the choir. The choir knows what to do and they have a willingness to do it. And if there is a professional development training on some issue focused on equity, you know what? The choir is going to be there. They're going to be front and center because they have a passion and intrinsic interest to serving these student demographics. The second group are those that we call the allies. The allies, they don't necessarily know what to do. They're committed to student equity, they're committed to social justice and education, but they may not have the exact training that they need to be able to be as successful as they could be. So the bridge between the allies and the choir oftentimes is opportunities to engage in additional development. So, and those are two groups that represent a core group of our faculty and educators on this campus. And so when we think about unveiling professional development, the choir is going to show up. The allies, we tend to have to be a little bit more hands-on with them. But then there's some groups that may not have the same kind of disposition. So the groups on the bottom, both are characterized by not necessarily having a willingness to employ the strategies and practices that are necessary. They have engaged in being educators and teaching in certain ways for a long period of time, and they don't just see like a real need to change their practice. So the first group on the left-hand side is called the resistors. The resistors, they don't necessarily know what to do, and they're not really willing to do it either. So sometimes we jokingly refer to it as the don't know, don't care group, right? As it relates to equity at least. And there's two different types of resistors. There's active resistors and there's passive resistors. Active resistors actively resist. When they hear that myself or Frank are coming to talk about these issues, these are all true, they will send out an email to the entire campus and say, why are we focused on, say, men of color? Why aren't we focused on X population, fill in the blank, whatever X might be? Or isn't this an example of reverse racism because we're focusing on this one group and talking about this one group? Or they might be a department chair who decides to hold a mandatory faculty meeting at the same time to prevent other people from going. Other examples, we'll just stop there. But active resistors, active resistors actively resist, right? So they're very vocal, and sometimes when it comes to these equity issues, we think that they represent a larger demographic than they actually do because they're so vocal. Now, the other part of the resistors are those who are passive. Passive resistors really just kind of want to stay out of the fray. They don't really want to get involved. They don't really care, right? They're just really focused on doing the work that they're doing. They're not going to show up to a training on microaggressions, but they're also not going to make a big stink about it if people do. They just want to stay out of the fray. They might say something negative about it behind the scenes, but it's not really their thing. Then there's the defiant. The defiant is a really interesting group because they've been exposed to numerous training and development opportunities. The defiant has been forced to sit through many mandatory trainings on all kinds of different equity issues, but you know what? Despite that exposure, they simply do not have a willingness to do it. And so what I want you to do is to think about yourself and to think about your colleagues and where they might fall. And to recognize that every single one of these individuals is part of our community. And every single one of them can contribute, but ultimately, if we're really going to move forward the equity agenda, we really have to get more people to become part of the choir. So we talk about in our work what we call the 3 E's. With the choir, we want to empower them with strategies and practices that can help them to continue doing the work that they're doing even better than they're already doing it. So we host a program, we invite the choir, they come. Then with the choir, after that program is ended, we want to ask them as they go out the door to list the names of 3 individuals who they consider to be allies. And typically, the choir knows the allies because they're the allies for them in their own departments. Then the next thing when you do is you have another event, right? And you ask the choir to come back, and this time the allies come as well. But with the allies, because they may not be as directly committed to some of these efforts, you have to be a little bit more hands-on. So instead of just sending them an email, maybe you want to do an email with a follow-up phone call or something along those lines, right? So it's a little bit more intrusive, but they'll come too. Then with the next group, there's resistors. Remember, there's 2 different types, active and passive. With the passive resistors, our job is to encourage them. That's the 3rd E. So empower, educate, encourage. And specifically, we want to encourage them to care. Because if we can get them to care, we can likely get them to employ the strategies and practices that are necessary. So in order to get them to care, typically it's a bridge of information. So being able to show them data from the campus quantitatively, qualitative data that demonstrates that there's an issue. And what we like to do is when we do present our results to a campus, we like to have a table of students who can also then react, right, to what we said, because it's easy for a person to see data and be like, oh, well, how's that collected? Or I see that quote, but I'm sure that's not really reflective of what our students experience. Nothing more powerful than to show something, have a faculty member say that, and then have a student say, but you know what, that happened to me yesterday, right? And so that's one of the ways. And we've seen people go, I have people come up to me all the time and say, I used to be a passive resistor, but I don't know if I'm a choir member yet, but I'm trying to be an ally, right? And that's ultimately what we want to do. We can make movement, right? And so we can create, essentially, we want to think about it as a snowball approach, constantly going out and bringing more and more people until we've created an environment and culture where it's difficult to be an active resistor or defiant. Now, I mentioned that there's 3 E's. There's 4 groups, really 5 groups if you think about the active resistors. So you might be asking yourself, well, what do you do with them? Some people have jokingly said, well, you need to add a 4th E and call it eliminate. And I don't believe that that's the way to move forward, because ultimately they're part of our campus community. And there are things that they can do to contribute to the mission of our institution. So what we recommend is redirecting, giving the active resistors and the members of the defiant the space, the freedom, and the resources to do the things that they like to do that still can contribute to the institutional mission. So maybe we have an active resistor who really loves assessment work. Let's give them all the freedom they want to be able to do that, right? Or maybe they like to set up certain types of partnerships. Let's give them the space and freedom to do that, whatever it might be. But ultimately, our goal is to create an environment where it's difficult for them to remain parts of those groups, where they wake up one morning and they realize that either I'm going to become part of this equity initiative and really commit to doing this, or maybe this isn't a good fit for me anymore. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. But I believe that we can eventually move hearts. It just takes time. Now, the last thing I'll say is this. Recently, we've added a new group to it. I actually had a slide in it, and then I took it out, and I took it in, and I took it out, and I took it out. But there's actually a 5th group that we've added. And it actually fits as a diamond here in the center. And we call that group the oblivious. Because they think they know, but they don't really. And they think they're willing, but they're not really willing. Right? They are individuals who can talk a great equity game. They are individuals who come off as very progressive and student-oriented and social justice-oriented when it comes to these issues. But we're like, do they really know what that means? Because their practice, their viewpoints, their dispositions would really indicate otherwise. And what can be very difficult and sometimes even in terms of our overall efforts more dangerous about them is that they see themselves and this work as being part of what they do, but they're really not committed to it. So they might even use the language and they might use it well, right? They might throw out words like equity, student success. They might be, real dangerous and use a word like colonization or, neoliberalism, right? But when it comes down to it, they're really not committed to the same kind of efforts that we are. So with that group, we think that yes, it's also like the allies, there's a need for training, but it's also for them, it's more of a deeper awakening as to what this work really means. And that involves honest conversations from loving colleagues who can sit down and really tell them, like, I think this is how you identify, but in reality, this is not really what's taking place. Now, this is a model that we use that helps to inform the work that we do. We call it the socio-ecological outcomes model, and it follows a simple, what we call an IEO approach: inputs, experiences, outcomes. And what it essentially does is it helps to inform the research that we do as it relates to students in general, particular underserved students, and then of course, particular men of color. It looks at background and defining factors and societal pressures, and then how those influence 5 domains that are central to understanding student success. One is non-cognitive outcomes, so those are like the effective dispositions that students have, like their confidence in their academic abilities, their perceptions of the usefulness of college. The academic domain, which really looks at their engagement and interactions on campus. The environmental domain, those are those things that occur outside of college that influence students' lives inside of college, such as food and housing insecurity, transportation concerns, legal matters, whatever that might be. The campus ethos, which is the climate and culture of this institution. And then the structural domain, which is the structures that we have in place that actually impede many of our equity efforts. And I'll talk about what some of that looks like. And essentially all those work together to influence student success. And this is kind of like the very bare bones kind of model. This is the souped up version. And the good news is that we have until 2 o'clock, so we're going to get to talk about each and every single one of these. I'm just kidding. We're going to highlight a few of these that I think are really important for this conversation here today. So first, we're going to talk about stereotypes and how that plays into the success of our students. And we'll delve further into this into the second session. But in the work that we do, we recognize that there are numerous societal factors that influence the experiences of our students of color. But stereotypes ends up being one real central one. And typically when we're talking about our students of color, the stereotypes really fall into 3 primary areas. Now, there's many different types of stereotypes, and we'll talk about what some of those look like. But really, if we're going to focus on really moving forward the needle, we have to talk about the big 3. So the big 3 also tend to relate to microaggressions that many of our students of color might experience. So the first one deals with essentially what we call an ascription of intelligence, which really is this notion of academic inferiority that is oftentimes ascribed to many of our students, where we assume certain groups are academically incapable of being successful. Now, oftentimes when I do this, I'll show this chart that helps to basically talk about where this initially begins. And now I'm wishing I had put it in, but basically it's a chart from early childhood education that looks at kindergarten and looks at different ways in which teachers were asked to respond to students. And essentially what we find in that work is that beginning as early as kindergarten, the federal government asks teachers, do you perceive the students in your class as being incapable of learning? Which is a great question. And you would think that in kindergarten you would find 0% of educators would say that that's true, but unfortunately we find that our Black and Latino students are significantly overrepresented in the students who educators report as being incapable of learning that early on. And of course, those kinds of perceptions are informed by our society. We've been taught to view certain student groups in certain ways, and it brings me to the very first study that I ever did. The very first study I ever did was I went to a community college. It was in the southwestern United States, and I interviewed Black men on that campus. And I asked them to tell me about the factors that influence their success. And many of them talked about this notion of being apprehensive to engage in the classroom. In fact, I published a piece in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education called Apprehension to Engage, and I called it that rather than calling it disengagement, because it wasn't that the students didn't care or weren't willing, it's that they were worried about how they were being perceived. And this is one of the quotes that came from that. It was from a student who said, I needed the most help in my writing, and the teacher was looking at me like, here we go, we have another R kid in class now. And the students in that study noted that sometimes a faculty member would ask a question in class and they would know the answer, but they wouldn't say anything. Or a faculty member just went over a whole bunch of new material and some of the concepts didn't totally click with them, and they knew that they needed to ask a question, and the faculty member provided an opportunity for that to take place. And again, they didn't want to say anything. And the faculty member would say, hey, you know, if anybody needs any help, my office hours are from this time to this time. And the student would know that they would need to go, but they wouldn't go. And then, of course, being a researcher, my follow-up question was, why? And they would say, well, they'll think I'm dumb. They'll think I'm ignorant. They'll think I'm stupid. They'll think I'm the word that's on the screen. And we have to recognize that a lot of these students have been taught throughout their lives and through their experiences, beginning very early on, as early as kindergarten, that they are academically inferior. So there's this worry that's constantly going through their minds, which requires then us as educators to be extremely proactive in reaching out to them and creating opportunities for us to proactively engage them, because this is oftentimes a demographic that's fearful of doing so. The second stereotype that we see that's pretty common is what's called an assumption of criminality, where students are assumed to be deviant or dangerous or up to no good, or, you know, there's some sort of kind of criminalized perspective. And here's a quote that comes from one of the studies that I did with Dr. Harris. It says, I can't tell you how many times I'll be sitting at the study cubicles and security will come to me. By the way, this occurred in the library, in case you're wondering where the study cubicles were. And the security would come to me and ask me for my student ID. At first, I thought it was something that they did to everybody when it got late. But then I started to notice that they'd ask me for mine and didn't ask anyone else for theirs. And so this is oftentimes the kind of experiences that our students have. And what we oftentimes talk about is in the context of what we call the step back. So let's say that you know, this is my class and I've been teaching my class, and you're my students, and then after class, students are coming up to come talk to me, and I have students approaching me from different areas, and I have maybe a man of color who comes up in my periphery, and I catch just a glimpse of him as he comes to me, or any student of color, really. And because of the way that I've been programmed by society to view this individual, unconsciously, not even purposely, I just step back just a little bit, right? And program fear towards that student. And then I'm thinking to myself, why did I do that? Oh my gosh, I'm an equity-minded educator. I support my students. I just went to these trainings, so let me try to make up for it. So what do? I try to cover it up, right? I smile. I put my hands in a welcoming position. I say something very positive to the student, which only serves to further reinforce the fact that that's exactly what occurred. And unfortunately, one of the things that we find is that you cannot teach someone who you fear, because when you fear them, it will mar all those micro-level interactions. And so that's why we do a lot of work, again, on unconscious bias and microaggressions, because it helps us to kind of confront that and figure out how we can deal with that to move the agenda forward for the students that we're working with. And the last one is this notion of pathologizing culture. And it's really deeply related to this work on equity, because it looks at how we view our students in the communities they come from, their communication styles, and basically, this quote helps to depict what that looks like. Is when we have kind of this negative connotation about students, we make these kind of broad, sweeping statements. Here's a quote from an educator says, yeah, so I feel like that stigma or a student that has some effect on the way professors interact with you. I noticed a little shortness with a few of the professors that I have dealt with. I guess their assumption is you probably won't be here after financial aid gets distributed. So they're a little hands-off, so you really don't, so they really don't take you seriously until the third week of school or you show up in their office. So this is where we say things like about our students where they're lazy, they don't care, or one that we hear pretty often, which is also evident here, is, well, they're just here for the financial aid. The students who we do work on are very likely to experience transportation concerns, having trouble just getting to campus. Very likely to be struggling with food insecurity. Very likely to be struggling with some form of housing insecurity, not necessarily homeless, but having difficulty in finding a place to stay. This is kind of the common experience for many of the students that we've researched. So from my perspective, having a perspective that we say, well, they don't care or they're lazy, it's the exact opposite. Really, this is a student group who's more dedicated and resilient than any other when we're talking about our students of color. But oftentimes we don't think about that because we haven't been taught to. The second area is really when we're talking about non-cognitive outcomes. So there's different types that we can look at here. You'll see different words on the screen, self-efficacy, locus of control. Let me just give you the kind of quick and dirty definitions. So students' confidence in their academic abilities, their feeling of control over their academic futures, their perceptions of the usefulness of college, their focus in school, and their authentic interest in what they're learning in the classroom. These are kind of the big five that we look at in our work, and we see that they have an influence on student success. So now we're looking at what is kind of going on in the mind of the student. And here's a quote from a student that helps to paint a picture of what that looks like. He says, or she says, "I worry that being here is not worth it because I see a lot of people that graduated from college with all sorts of degrees and still can't get a job and are still struggling. So I'm like, damn, I'm spending all this money on student loans. What's going to happen if I don't get a job?" In our work, we also are attentive to the role that identity has. So we do, again, a lot of work focused on men of color. And though I'm not focusing solely on men of color here, it is one breakout that I want to do and talk about the role that male identity has on student success, especially when I was looking at the data and we can see that looks like maybe one of the lowest performing groups may be, for example, black males on this campus. And identity is something that plays into account with this population. And we look at it in our work in three primary areas. One, we look at help seeking. Are students willing to seek out help, accept help when it's offered, and follow through with that help? Because we know, unfortunately, many men in general, across groups, are concerned that by engaging in in help seeking that they're going to be perceived as being lesser than, weak, or inferior. When we add in the fact that many of these students are students of color, there's also this perception again that, well, they don't belong here because they're academically incapable. So you put those two identities together, and we oftentimes find that many of our men of color struggle with help seeking because it's something that conflicts with both their racial identity and their masculine identity. We also find that many of our students are concerned because they perceive college to be a domain, particularly our men, a domain that's really suited for women. They see college and school as more of a thing that women do. And that begins early on. So I want you to think about this. If I was to ask you the general, as the average nationally, race and gender of a K-12 teacher, what would it be? A white female, right? Everyone got that right. So what would be a white female? And so what we find is that boys in general struggle throughout the educational system, across groups, and we find that students of color also struggle in general across groups. And a lot of what we believe is that some of that, not all of it, but some of it is attributable to the fact that if you're not educated in a classroom where you see someone in front of the classroom who looks like you, you can start to disassociate with school, seeing it as something that's really not designed for you. So what we find is that by 4th, 5th, 6th grade, boys in general across groups begin to see school as something that's really designed for girls because they never see someone in the front of the classroom who looks like them. So by the time they hit those grades, the boy who is raising his hand, who's studious, who engages with the teacher is typically the same boy who's being picked on and bullied in the schoolyard. Now, of course, that is a generalization, but it is something that is a common experience that's talked about pretty extensively in the masculinity literature. And then the last one is perceiving like an imbalance or a conflict between being a breadwinner and being a student. If I'm a man, I'm supposed to go out and make money and provide for myself, for my family, and not being able to do that makes me less of a man. And unfortunately, one of the things we find is that, especially because we see there's a lot of part-time students who are part-time here. Well, my guess is if you were to ask a lot of them, one of the reasons that they're going part-time is because what? They're working, right? Why? Because they've been taught that that's something that they need to do, which is true, right? But there can also times be a conflict. So here's just a quote that helps to paint what that looks like for students. And this is a quote from a student from a study that Frank did. It says, "What kind of man has 2 kids and quits working so he can go and read poetry at some damn college?" It helps to paint the picture of like what's going on in the mind of some guys, right? I mean, that's a real quote. Here's another one that looks at this concept of help seeking. How many of you here are familiar with the work of Victor Sines? Okay, one person. Okay, so Victor Sines, he is an incredible researcher. He's in this state. He's at UT. Definitely would suggest connecting with him as it relates to his work on Latino males. And here's a quote that comes from the work that he does. He says, "It also comes from a sense of pride. You know, you're always taught to be a man, and you're proud. And if you fall, if you stumble, then it's your own fault. You don't bring anybody down with you. You don't ask for help because it's your doing. You shouldn't have to ask anybody for help. And so it's just that sense of pride that carry over that in the end makes you fail." So we can see that oftentimes if there's a guy who thinks that having to seek out help is something that is something, you know, that I have to do, but that is something that also makes other people see me as weak or inferior, they're not going to do it. They're not going to raise their hand in class. They're not going to go to office hours. They're not going to go to tutoring because they're worried about what people are going to think about them. Stressful life events is another thing that our students are facing. Our students are facing numerous challenges externally. And here is just one example of what that looks like. We had a student who said, "I had more than a few family members die in the past 2 years, so it's just hard to focus. I kind of lost my motivation and I really can't focus. My family needs me now more than ever before. When I'm in class, I'm physically there, but my mind isn't." Students who are experiencing real challenges externally. We also know that many students experience transportation challenges. And here's an example of what that looks like. I have to take 3 buses to get to school. And by the way, where we go in the country, it looks different. So sometimes it's buses, sometimes it's trains, sometimes it's the trolley system. Sometimes students are having to get rides from friends, or they're relying upon an unreliable vehicle, or they're walking long distances. But transportation tends to be a real concern. It says, I have to take 3 buses to get to school. Transportation is a real concern. If I miss one bus or one bus runs late, it means that I don't make it to class on time. Yeah, I spend like an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, just getting to school. One bus goes late, one bus arrives early, and the student shows up late to class. Took them an hour and a half to get there. They sit in the back of the class. They come in, faculty members like, see, they're always coming in late. They don't care. It's rational, right? As an educator, I mean, sometimes I make these deductions myself, not thinking about what's actually going on that would lead to that kind of pattern take place. Again, I also mentioned that we do a lot of work on food and housing insecurity. We have students who are experiencing real concerns. Now, housing insecurity is a large concept. It includes students who can be homeless, which is truly a demographic that we have to be aware of, but can also include students who are sleeping in a car, sleeping in a closet, in an untenable living situation. And this is data from our sample of colleges that we participated, who participated in our surveys, looking at students who experience some form of housing insecurity overall. So if you look at the bars on the far right that are in red, what you'll see is that the first thing that might pop out to you is, wow, a lot of students experience these challenges. About a third of students across the board in our sample. And of course, you can see some students who experience this challenge even more so. In our sample, for example, we find that our Southeast Asian students, so students who are Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian, Vietnamese, African American students, particularly black men, experience this challenge to a very high degree. We also know that some of our students, in addition to worrying about where they're going to stay, are also worried about what they're going to eat. And there's been a lot of work that's been done on food insecurity. Our work is a little bit different, one, because we collect data in class, and unfortunately most of the work that's been done on food insecurity uses an online survey, which is, methodologically, it doesn't make sense. Let's just, I could go on a whole tangent about how that is not necessarily a good approach to doing research on students who experience external challenges. But Anyways, what we look at are students who experience the most acute form of food insecurity. And here's the data that we have. These are students who report that they face the threat of hunger. So this isn't students who have marginal food insecurity issues. These are students with acute food insecurity challenges. And you'll see that oftentimes we find, especially across the data that we have, that men tend to experience this challenge more. We think it's partly associated with help seeking. I'm not going to ask for something to eat, I'm just not going to eat. And we can also see that, though, across the board, there is a sizable percentage of our students who are experiencing this challenge not knowing what to eat. And we'll oftentimes hear faculty members who talk about how they keep like granola bars in their bags or food in their offices because they have students who come in who are hungry. You know, it's hard to focus in class when you're thinking about what to eat. I mean, I like to eat a lot, so I can't go, if I go a couple hours without eating, I start to get cranky and unfocused. So imagine going a few days, right? And that's what we do know students experience. But despite all those different things, again, we know that the factors that have the greatest influence on success are really what we do. Interestingly, when we model all of those different areas of challenge that students might experience, what we find is that when we have students feel a sense of belonging, when they feel welcome to engage, when they have people who validate them, that the negative effect of those external pressures, even the insecurities, are lessened and that they're more likely to be successful. So that's good because, again, we have the ability to be able to change some of these outcomes that we see for our students. And so there's a number of different ways that we can think about this. One is, and it was mentioned earlier, creating a sense of belonging for students, making sure that students know that they belong here, that they matter. Too often, that's not a message that our students know or hear. In fact, one of the things that I've learned in doing this work is that most educators believe that their students can be successful. Not all, but most. Most educators believe that their students have the ability to succeed and are capable, but oftentimes those messages are never verbally expressed. And what we find with this population is if you don't say it, there's no way that they would believe it, because why would they? Too few of them have ever had experiences where they've received those kinds of messages or validation. In fact, how many here have heard of the concept of growth mindset? All right. Growth mindset is a decent concept that helps us to understand certain aspects of success for certain student demographics, but it also has a key flaw. So in Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, one of the things she says is that we should focus on validating students, which one, effort or ability? Effort. Why? Because when we validate effort, it creates students who are hardy, who are resilient, who develop grit and all those things that we want them to do to be able to move forward against any challenge that they face. And that's true. We should validate students' effort. That's something that should be part of the normal conversation that we have with students. But when we're talking about our students of color, and the flaw in the work is that there's an assumption that students have, at some point in their career, throughout their academic journey, been validated for their ability to actually be able to do the work itself. And when we're talking about our students of color, that's something that's not always present in their background experiences. And so when we're talking about our students of color, there's a need to validate both their ability and their effort. It has to be actually a balance between the two. And in fact, it was one of the things that came out of the Black Minds course is that Dr. Dweck said, you know what, she said that she acknowledged, because we provided a pretty strong critique of the work, that said, you know what, you're right. For some student demographics, there does need to be a balance. So that's something I think for us to keep in mind. Here's some quotes to help to demonstrate that. On the left-hand side are things that we probably shouldn't do. So here's a first quote from a student. Says, there are some teachers that will tell you, I've probably given 1 A in the last 3 years. This is a quote from a student. That's BS. Because you even get to class and you know you can't get an A. If we want to motivate students to perform well, probably telling them that they're probably not going to get an A in our class, like you got no chance. I'm giving out 1 in the past 3 years, is not the way to start it off. Now, I know like some educators, I've seen educators do some of these things sometimes. Now here's something that probably more of us are guilty of than we would like to admit. But sometimes what we want to do on that first day of class is really set that expectation and kind of weed out those students who really aren't really here, right? Those students who aren't going to be dedicated. So what we do is we come in with our syllabus, and it has all these different rules that we have in place and all these different guidelines, and we try to come off as tough as we can. And we do that because we know that, hey, some of these students are going to end up leaving and not coming back. And the ones that stay, those are the ones that are probably really meant to be here. It's a flawed approach, because what it does is it turns off students who are already walking into that classroom worried about whether they even belong there to begin with. We got to realize when we're talking about community college students, the average age of a community college student nationally, we're talking about particularly our students of color, is 28 to 29 years old, right, nationally. So these are students who have oftentimes went through high school, went out into the workforce or into the military, or didn't do anything, right? Or apprenticeship programs, whatever it might be. And they've gotten to the point where they're like, you know, I have to come back to school. I'm not being advanced. I'm not getting the opportunities. Things didn't work out the way I wanted to. And then the first thing they do is they come to our campuses, right? And they take an assessment test. And they're already worried about their abilities. One, they weren't really a good student to begin with in terms of how they conceptualize themselves. And second, it's been a long time since they've been out of the classroom. The first thing we do is to give them an assessment test in typically math and writing and English, which only affirms that because we're testing them on material that they haven't seen for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 years. And they do horrible on that. So now they're thinking to themselves, now I really don't belong here. This test only affirmed what I was already worried about. And then the first day of class, they walk in and we're trying to beat on them, like this is what you need to do to be successful in our class. And then we wonder why we lose students so early on. Now, I'm an educator, I'm a faculty, instructional faculty, I teach classes. I've been guilty of some of these practices at some points in my career. Right? So it's all of us, but it's thinking about how can we move beyond doing that. Another quote from a student says, when faculty members see me, they put their heads down, they pretend like they don't see me, they walk the other direction and pretend to get on the phone. Now we're laughing, right? But the truth is, every time we go to a campus, we hear that as a theme that comes out amongst particularly our men of color. Now, I have a couple things that I rationalize as to why that occurs. So the first is that there are some educators who really do this, right? Who really unconsciously don't realize what they're communicating to a student. And these are typically the interactions that occur outside a classroom. Again, see the student, maybe in my mind, like, dang, I don't really know their name, but I know they're in their class. Maybe they're not going to see me, ghost for a minute, I don't know, right? Or maybe it's a student, a faculty member who's got a lot on their plate. I'm teaching 4 or 5 classes. I'm sitting on this committee and that committee. I'm just trying to get to the next thing. I'm just trying to do what I need to get done. But I don't realize that this is what I'm communicating to my students. And so this is why in the work that we talk about, we don't really like the concept of talking about engagement in isolation, because it's not simply whether or not a student's engaged, it's whether or not we made them feel welcome to engage with us. And if we lose that part of the conversation, we lose the fact that sometimes students are weary about asking questions in class or responding to questions in class. They're weary about engaging us outside of the classroom, smiling at us, waving, saying hello, because they think that maybe we don't want to. So it's about whether or not also we've been intentional in demonstrating that their engagement is both desired and invited. Here's what that looks like. Professors who are here for the passion of working with students really make a difference. Professors who really care and take the time to get to know you are the ones that I learn from the most. And then the last area is the structural domain. And these are the things that we do as a campus, that sometimes we structure things in a way that inhibits us from being as successful as we could be because of the structures that we have in place. Now, some of these might apply here, some of these might not, but these are things that we've learned and seen different campuses. So the first one that I'm going to give you is an example of early alert systems. So don't tell me if you have one or not, because I'd rather not know before I say this in case I put my foot in my mouth. All right, because then it's not about you, it's just about the places we've been. So oftentimes we'll go to a campus and they'll have an early alert system, or sometimes they don't, right? Which, you know, hey, if you don't have one, let's work on starting one. But if you do have one, oftentimes we find that the early alert system isn't really successful. And here's a couple of reasons why. One, when faculty members, like, first of all, does everyone know what an early alert is? Okay, all right, cool. So when faculty members fill out whatever form it is, whether it's an online form, paper form, depending upon the campus, it goes into a black box. And no one ever knows what happens with it after that. There's no like feedback loop to say, hey, we met with the student, this occurred, so that people know that, hey, using this is actually worth their doing. It can be that, and this has actually happened twice now, where I said, does the campus have an early alert system? And faculty members were like, yeah, it does, we use it. And then someone from IT said, oh, actually that system's broken, it's not working right now. Right? Talk about like an awkward moment. Another one that we see that actually happens pretty commonly is that there's an early alert system, but the alert triggers halfway through the semester. So halfway through the semester, it's typically too late to make an intervention that's really meaningful. And so what we say is at that point, you don't have an early alert system, you have an early drop system. Because at that point, that's really the only thing the student can do. So there's a lot of reasons why we see that early alert systems don't work, but here's just a quote that helps to paint a picture about what that looks like. Many colleges, community colleges, are required to have an early alert system. However, a noticeable contingent of these systems simply do not work, are not used by faculty, and notify academic advisors far too late into the semester, halfway through the semester, far beyond the point where an intervention could curb challenges. Maybe some of that is relevant here, maybe it's not. But having an early alert system that works is one of the most important things. Like strategy number one, having an early alert system would be like my recommendation. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is when we're talking about our students, and we're talking about our students of color and our students who are the most underserved, they are typically not taught as much by our full-time faculty. They're more likely to be taught by our part-time faculty. So let me tell you one of the reasons why that occurs. Basic skills, developmental education, remedial education, it's called different things in different locations. One of the things that you'll find is that as a pattern in general, most of those classes are taught overwhelmingly by part-timers. Why? Well, if I'm a faculty member in math, I want to teach calculus. I might not necessarily want to teach basic skills or developmental education because maybe those classes aren't the ones that really stimulate me as much, right? So we find that oftentimes they end up prioritizing the classes that are higher on the level and maybe avoid the classes that are lower on the level. So typically what happens then is our students are exposed overwhelmingly to part-time faculty. Part-time faculty who are good, well-meaning people who do great work, but there are oftentimes structural things that prevent them from being as successful as they could be. Here are some of those. Oftentimes we find that they do not have office space. If we're talking about the students who need the most support, but they're being taught by faculty members who don't have a place to meet with them, that seems like there's a challenge. Or they don't get paid for the office hours, or they have schedules that prevent them from meeting with students. Or if there is office space, it's located in the bungalows of campus, and there's no way for students to really readily access it, and they have an office, but it's shared by like 4 or 5 other people. Those are things that we find that's a common factor. Another thing that we find that's pretty common is that they are typically not exposed to professional development on our campus. Now, there are typically some real financial challenges that prevent that from taking place, but we have to think about if we have students who are in the most need of support and are taught by faculty members who structurally cannot provide it, it creates a system where sometimes every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. And so in our national data, what we've done is that, remember that survey I was telling you about, our instructional development inventory where we're looking at different key practices for teaching and learning? Here are our key practices for teaching and learning. collaborative learning, culturally relevant teaching, performance monitoring, relationship building, having an institutional responsibility perspective. All these things, right, that we know are important for student success. And you can see on just our national map, we have a color coding system where the scores are acceptable, they're emerging concerns, they need attention, and they're immediate concerns. Immediate concerns, red is danger, like we have to focus on this. And you'll notice that when we look at our data for part-time faculty, what we find is that our part-time faculty who are teaching at multiple institutions, what we call freeway flyers, are the ones who typically have the most challenges in doing these practices. These also happen to be faculty members who are typically overwhelmingly represented in basic skills or developmental education. In fact, what we found is in our national data, and it might not be true here, but it is true nationally, that there are more freeway flyers, part-time faculty who are teaching at multiple institutions, than all full-time faculty members across designations combined as a national pattern. So it just says for us to think about some of these things. Okay, so what are some things that we can be doing? What are some things that we can be doing? Well, I have some recommendations for some different levels. So one, institutional commitment. If we're going to continue doing this equity work, this equity thing, it's important for us to have campus leaders who communicate the urgency about focusing on groups experiencing disproportionate impact at high-profile events. With this campus, check. That's taking place, right? But it's important. Why? I've been to places where we're going to have a conversation on equity and no one from the administration shows up. What does that say about commitment? What does that say about the urgency and the importance? Hire personnel with a proven record of success in teaching our underserved students. As we think about hiring and the new faculty members that we bring on, those who are part-timers, those who are full-timers, we have to look and think and make sure that we're bringing on people who can be as successful as they possibly can in engaging our students. Oftentimes we'll go places and we'll see that the hiring process involves a 1-hour general interview which includes a 50-minute Q&A and a 10-minute teaching demonstration. But the vast majority of what that person will be doing with our students is teaching. So it would make more sense to have a 50-minute teaching demonstration where maybe we have a rubric that looks at these different practices so we can assess the extent to which they'll be as successful as they could be with their students. The other thing that we do that helps us get away from having the educators that we need around the table sometimes is that we don't ask the right questions. So oftentimes what we'll see is an interview question that says something to this effect. We'll have a whole bunch of different questions and there'll be the one diversity question. Everybody knows the diversity question, right? Can you tell me about your experiences in working with diverse student populations? Anybody ever heard that one before? Guess what? Anybody can answer that question. You know why? Because it tells you about an individual's exposure to diversity, not their commitment. It'd be better for us to ask, can you give me some tangible ways in how you've changed your teaching and learning to accommodate the needs of diverse learners? And then ask them to give you concrete things that they've done in their instruction. That's going to give you a totally different response because anyone can say, hey, I went to this diverse school, I taught this diverse group of students, I was in this diverse committee. That doesn't tell you about anything but exposure. Implement a campus-wide early alert system. This campus has some clear equity goals. Those goals need to be implemented into the institution's strategic plan. Because what we find is that a lot of campuses have equity plans, they have inclusion plans, they have diversity plans, and unless those items are embedded into the strategic plan, the long-term commitment to those efforts after there's turnover in administration typically subsides. Identify advocates for working with underserved students within each of our different departments. Oftentimes you'll go to a campus and they'll have like a commitment to serving students who are current or former foster youth, and you'll see like pins or badges that show that they have received training in those areas. Or you'll go to an office and there'll be a sticker on the door that represents that they're willing to serve that, willing and able to serve that student demographic. Well, we just need to be more willing and able to serve all these different demographics and think about how can we create people who are within our departments who've been exposed to strategies and practices for serving each of those populations and bringing that back. We need to increase the representation of full-time faculty members in our developmental education, and we need to provide high-impact professional development for all of our faculty and staff. One-time events, don't do it. They're helpful. They raise awareness. They get at the passive resistors, which is very important, probably the most important thing we can do, but it takes intensive, ongoing professional development. And I'm gonna tell you why. Most classroom educators, I'm not even gonna talk about you, I'm gonna talk about myself. I'm a faculty member in a college of education. But no one has ever sat down and went through a formal teaching process with me where they said, okay, well, I have someone who comes in to observe my class once a semester, but I wasn't trained to formally teach. I'm a subject matter expert. I got a bachelor's in Black history. I got a master's in college student affairs, a master's in child development, a PhD in educational leadership and policy studies. I'm an expert in those areas. I teach statistics mostly. But I'm not necessarily a pedagogue. That's something that I've had to learn and develop over time. Think about a faculty member, maybe one of our part-timers. They get a bachelor's degree in biology. They go and they work in industry for a couple of years. They get a master's degree in biology. We bring them into the classroom. Typically no onboarding, no training in how to teach. And so what do people do then? They teach how they were taught. And unfortunately, how they were taught is typically not how our students of color learn. In terms of more strategies for success, beyond that first set, is within each academic division or department, however it's conceptualized here, I believe that there's a need to set targets for those students groups who experience disproportionate impact. So at that divisional level, right, looking at the outcomes data, the student success data that the campus has, identifying those groups that are experiencing disproportionate impact, and then having a standing division meeting item every meeting where that's discussed. What are we doing around that? If it ends up falling off the agenda and it's not part of the conversation, then we're typically not doing as much about it as we need to be, and we're not as intentional. Using culturally relevant teaching is a very important strategy that works. There's a lot of research that supports the importance of cultural relevance. You have probably many great disciplinary experts here on this campus who can help make that happen. So for example, one of the things that I'll find if I go someplace, there'll be a faculty member who's in chemistry who'll say, I want to do that whole culturally relevant teaching thing. I know it's important. You've talked about it. I've heard other people say that, but I don't even know what to do or where to start. And it takes more work to do it because it's typically not how our disciplines have taught us and trained us. But the good news is that you have people here on your campus who can help you do that. Educators in fields such as ethnic studies and cultural studies and gender studies and cultural anthropology and sociology can readily serve as resident experts to help support the incorporation of cultural relevance. Establishing professional learning communities, PLCs, that continue dialogue on culturally relevant teaching or any of the other practices that are important for our underserved students. Again, having regular conversations on that. There was the Black Minds Matter course where we talked about issues facing Black boys and men. This campus was a site for that. That was an example of a PLC. There are many campuses that are going to be doing replay sites this spring. So maybe that's something that for those of you who didn't get to participate in the fall, you might want to do. There's a lot of different strategies and practices for working with that specific demographic. Engaging in ongoing collective sense making at the campus and unit level, meaning we have a process that we use. You might have heard of it called like the 5 whys. We do it a little bit differently, but essentially what it looks at is getting down to what are some of the root causes of the issues that are facing our ability to be as successful as we could be, and then basically working on those issues. Here's just some really quick ones for classroom faculty. We believe it's important to require conferencing with all students throughout the semester. What does that mean? Office hours, tutoring services, whatever we know is important for student success, it shouldn't be optional, it should be mandatory. So for example, if I've taught my class 10 times, and I know that the students who are the most likely to be successful are the students who do multiple drafts of papers, students who go to the tutoring center, and the students who come see me during my office hours, then if I know that that's the key ingredients for students to be successful in my class, I should make it mandatory, not optional, because a lot of times our students don't do optional. They don't do optional because they're weighing that action against all the other things that they have on their plates that they need to be doing. So when we say it's optional or something that you should do, it doesn't communicate it to this in the same way than the sense of urgency of doing it that they need to hear. The other reason that we need to do it is, again, when we're talking about our students of color in general, overall, our men, and of course our men of color as well, help seeking is a real concern, right? So they may not use some of the resources and services that are available to them because they're worried about how it's going to be perceived. I was just having a conversation with one of your colleagues, Steve, and he was talking about the importance of really just being intrusive. One strategy that we say is like, hey, if you know a student needs some sort of support, like let's say we know a student, and talking with them, it's real clear that they need to go to financial aid, or it's real clear that they need to go to tutoring. Pick up the phone, call somebody who's in that office, as they're meeting with you, and say, hey, I'm meeting with this student. This is what they need. I'm sending them over to you right now. Will you be there to receive them? Or if you can, walk them over. Why? Because it's reducing another instance of help seeking. But it's also, of course, referring them to people who you know who are going to be as invested in them and their success as you are. We have to recognize the influence of microaggressions, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Discuss challenges that you've experienced. We call this appropriate disclosing. So when students see us in the front of the classroom, they see a finished product, at least in their minds. We all know that we're still improving and still growing, but that's not what they see. They see a finished product. They see a person who is typically very well spoken, very well dressed, all these great degrees, right? And they see this, and it's hard for them to relate to that, and hard for them to see the path that each one of us took to get to this point. They don't and may not realize the struggles academically, personally, professionally that we've had to go through to get to this point. We believe that to the degree that it is appropriate, that we should disclose some of those things, because one of the things that we hear regularly from our students is that serves as a source of inspiration for them. Now, that's not to say that I wouldn't be up here and say, oh, I know what it's like to be a Latino male because I'm a black male, or I know what it's like to be a this because I'm that. Statements of equivalency are always going to fall flat and bad and have the opposite of the intended effect. But just talk about your experience as it is, an experience, and let students take from it what they will, and you'll find that they find it to be very inspirational. Another thing that we believe in is structuring success early on. Again, think about that progression. A student goes into the workplace after high school, right? And then they come here, they take an assessment test which tells them that they're not good enough, and then they come into our classroom. It's important for us to build their confidence in their abilities. So at the beginning of every semester, one of the things I try to do is make the first couple weeks of my class something where I'm covering great content, but that the assignments that I'm giving are things that I know are going to help them learn some of those core concepts, but they may not be as difficult because I'm trying to build their confidence in their ability to do the work. But then as the semester progresses, the assignments get gradually harder and harder and harder, so that the relative rigor throughout my course is the same as it normally would be, right? But that first few weeks, it's a little bit different in order to be able to build their confidence in their ability to be able to do this work. Require supplemental instruction for classes that you find on this campus that tend to have high D's, F's, or withdrawal rates. Be intentional about warmly welcoming students to each class session. Student walks in, it's so good to see you, glad you're here. Something as simple as that goes a long way. Best thing we can do, know their names. Know their names. Now, some people might say, wait a second, I got 60 students in my class. I can't know everybody's name. Anybody thought that when I said know their names? Nobody?
I do it.
You do it?
Yes.
You know their names?
Yes.
All of them?
Yes.
That's what's up. We all need to do that. Can you say that again so everyone can hear it? Say it louder.
You get them into your office early and often. You structure your assignments. This goes to my colleague. He came up with the IDSD card. You get them into your office to see you after they do each assignment. and they must see you so that they can progress to the next part of the assignment. You do that, and after the second or third time you see them, you'll know their names.
Yep. And that's a practice that communicates to students that we care about them and we're invested in them. Now, some people might say, I can't possibly learn everyone in my class's name. I have far too many people. Well, what I say is this. Start out with those students who you know experience disproportionate impact. You think about it in terms of like a triage. Start out with those students who you know really need to build it, and then work throughout the semester to learn the rest of them. But there's students who you know either based upon your past experience in teaching the class or based upon your institution's data tend to experience disproportionate impact. Start with them and then work out from there. And then initiate communication with students who miss 2 or more class sessions. You have a student who misses a couple class sessions, you want to basically intercede, because what happens is this, it's much harder to get a student to come back after they've made a decision to leave than to intercede while you can see the decision starting to take place. You know, a student who is like, the first day of class they're sitting in the front, second day of class they're sitting in the middle, third day of class they're sitting in the back, fourth day of class they seem kind of like they're distracted, and then you're thinking to yourself, well, you know, I need to probably talk to that student, and then I'll get to them next week, and then next week they're not there anymore. That happens all the time. Or how many people have had this happen? You have a student who's performing decently well in your class, say they're getting a B, right, in your class, and then a quarter way through the semester they just disappear. Like no idea where they went, right? We can prevent a lot of that from taking place by being proactive and interceding. So lastly, just want to say, again, I operate a center outside of SDSU called the Center for Organizational Responsibility and Advancement. We have some online training programs if any of you all want to take advantage of them. They're in these different areas of teaching boys and young men of color, teaching men of color in community colleges, supporting men of color in community colleges, unconscious bias, racial microaggressions. They're continuing education units, so 1.5 CEUs for each of the different programs. We can either do it individually if anybody wanted to do it individually, or else we also have college partnerships. Just wanted to make you aware of that as one additional resource among many. So unfortunately, those classes are not free. Those are they have a cost associated with them because it costs us to do it and pay for our staff and people who are involved in that. And if you're saying to yourself, well, wait a second, I don't have a budget. My budget is free. There is another option, and that's that we did that, again, that Black Minds Matter course, and all of the information from that course is available. You can go to YouTube, my YouTube channel. All the sessions from all the different speakers and presenters that we had are available there for free. Anybody can go watch that at any time. These classes are a little bit different. They're more focused on strategies and practices. But still, I think you'll be able to glean some of the different strategies if you want to do it that way.